So in this video, we want to talk about Vellum curves. And just like you can simulate surfaces with Vellum, you can also simulate curves. But there is no Vellum curves actually, but there are two different types of curve simulations in Vellum, and that is hair and string. And we will have a look at the difference between the two in this video. Like I think I mentioned before, what this basically replaces is the wire solver. And this is something to keep in mind if you find old tutorials, or it's actually still usable for certain things. The wire solver we will not cover in this course, but this is kind of the older version of the same technique, with a couple of different approaches, but it could potentially worth looking into the wire solver if you need to simulate curves, but you should be able to do quite a lot with hair and string. One thing worth noting here is that the hair constraint is actually used in the hair system, or the fur system in Houdini. So up here in the shelf tools you can find hair utils and guide process and guide brushes. So all of this has to do with hair and fur, which we, at least at this point when I'm recording this, are not covering in the course. But what you will find is there are many notes about how to design your hair, but there is one node that you use then later to simulate your hair, and this is called guide simulation. And something just happened. Guide simulate. And in this node, what you will see is that you can actually define which kind of solver you want to use to internally calculate the hair behavior or the simulation. And before this was done by the wire solver, and now it's done by the Vellum solver. So this is where you will find this kind of constraint again, because this is actually used to calculate hair. Let's start with a simple line. So I just create a line node here, and then let's make sure we have a couple of points that we can actually work with. And to make it easier to see what's going on, let's rotate that guy to the side so that we have something like this. And what we want to make sure is that the first point is pinned in space, and then we just let it fall. So how do we do this? When we type in Vellum, we cannot, like I said, find Vellum curve or anything. We can't even find Vellum string, but there is at least a Vellum configure hair. I'm not 100% sure why there isn't a configuration for the string, but nonetheless, at least the hair is there. And up here, this, as you can see, this is just a normal constraint type called hair, and the next one is string. For now, let's start with a string, and we create a single Vellum solver, and we combine the whole thing the way we know it, so nothing special here. And when we just run it, this will just fall down. Okay, so this works. And now let's make sure that we take our first point and pin it in space. And just like with cloth, there is actually a pin to animation part here in the string constraint. So let's set it to 0. And if I run this and actually look through the solver, that would help. There you go. Then you should be able to see that this thing is hanging at 0 and it behaves like a string. So you can see, pretty straightforward. Of course, keep in mind, you have to give it enough points so they can work with. Of course, if you don't do that and keep it at the default, then you get something like this, which is more like a pendulum, which can actually be good to know that you can kind of simplify it that way. But nonetheless, in our case, we want something that is pretty bendy, and there you have it. Talking about bend and stretch stiffness, we can actually change them just like with cloth. So far pretty straightforward. So we can, for example, lower the stretch stiffness. There you go. So really the same rules apply. Let me actually turn the background to dark. The same thing applies. Let's go back with the string with the bend stiffness. So if I lower this even further, we should see potentially a bit more, wobbling and more rotation around the points. So this is all pretty straightforward and easy to understand when we understood how cloth works. And as well, keep in mind that the sub-steps play a big role when you work with curves. So what is the difference between hair and string? So let's look at an example I prepared here. First, let's just look at the curves again. It's basically the same setup as before. And you can see it's pretty straightforward. Just like before, we put our collision object here into the third input. So nothing special, nothing we don't already know. And what you can see here is that at first glance, they look the same. This time the hair is on the left and the string is on the right. But what you can see is this bendy kind of stiffness that the hair constraint comes with that the string constraint doesn't have. And this is what the hair constraint does. It creates more of a relationship between the points than the string constraint does. The string constraint is really just, you know, points and tries to keep the rough distance to each other, and that's about it. Whereas the hair constraint considers the orientation between the points, which you can actually don't see in this example, but you can see it as soon as we copy some boxes onto our curves. And then it looks like this. So now you can see much better the difference between the two. The string constraint doesn't have any information about the orientation of each point, especially relative to each other. And this is why those boxes now jump around, because they don't know what they should kind of align to. I think currently they're aligned to the velocity by default, but there is nothing that aligns them. The hair constraint, on the other hand, has internally actually an orient attribute that orients our boxes correctly, and this is why we see such a more complex and kind of connected behavior. You can actually see this if you middle click on the output. Out of the hair constraint comes an orient, which is a quaternion, which is a mathematical way of defining clear rotation in space in all axes, and it's saving that for some weird reason in 4 elements. So be it. But if we look at the string version, then we see we don't have anything like that. We don't even have a normal, nor do we have an up vector, nor do we have an orient. We have no information on those points about any kind of rotation or orientation. And this is what creates this, you know, random movement when we copy a box on the points, because I think, again, by default it uses the velocity. Now this can be very helpful when you know that you need that. The problem with that is that it also calculates a kind of relationship or dependency between the points when it comes to rotation, which can end up in certain perception of stiffness where you wouldn't expect it. So for example, in this case, a string which is just pinned in space on one point, you would probably expect it to move freely like this. A hair constraint, since it calculates the orientation between the points and calculates a so-called buckling effect, which means there's a tension in the elements if they rotate too much, let's call it this way. This kind of stiffness results from that. So sometimes a hair constraint can result in problems when you need something very loose, basically. Here's another example of this. I have a normal line here again, and I'm basically rotating this point in space. I'm not really rotating it, I'm just moving it around. And the hair constraint will automatically calculate a rotation that comes from that. So if we look at the result of a hair and a string constraint setup, then it looks like this. The top one is a hair constraint and the lower one is a string constraint. And as you can see again, the rotation of my pinned point here in the beginning is actually taken into account when the rest of the line is calculated. So the rotation is part of the simulation, whereas on this, in the string, this is just doing nonsense because there's no kind of direction or rotation. And this is why for a case like this, obviously a hair constraint is much better. That said, if you rotate it too much, what you can see is that it kind of flips and kind of corrects itself, which might not always be what you want, but this is how it behaves by default. So yeah, orientation, the main difference between hair and string constraints. And in the next couple of videos, we will actually look at a couple of examples how to use that in practical terms. So thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.